This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, as always, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal. This is part 2 of our interview with a very good friend of the show. In fact, I think he's the most frequent guest, Ali Abunimah. You probably know him from his great independent news website, the Electronic Intifada. Definitely check that out. And in part 1 of this episode, we talked about the potential foreign policy and the very hawkish policies of Joe Biden, the next U.S. president. And we talked about his Secretary of State nominee, Antony Blinken, a liberal interventionist who supported the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, the war in Yemen, and who's a strong supporter of Israel. We talked a lot about how this bipartisan support of Israel really unifies the Republican and Democratic parties, and it's just in general this hawkish imperialist foreign policy, and that I word, imperialism, is really just bipartisan in Washington. So we talked about that in the first part. Well, now we're going to talk about another element of imperialism a little bit, but we're moving over toward the French Empire, and we're talking about, in this second part, Emmanuel Macron, the French center-right president, this complete neoliberal. He's been praised by the U.S. Democratic Party as this great moderate leader, supposedly, who's going to try to save Europe and the European Union, a former banker turned president. But the reality is that Macron is he's going pretty authoritarian right now in France, really cracking down aggressively, especially on the Muslim population with these very Islamophobic policies. And he's really just trying to out Marine Le Pen, who's the far-right leader of the National Front, while they change their name, whatever, in France. And so, Ali Abunimah, you've been writing a lot about what's going on in France. It's not getting much media coverage in the United States, unfortunately. But let's talk about what's happening. And then also at the same time, there's a crackdown on protests. For months now, for really years, people have seen that there has been this anti-neoliberal movement, this kind of grassroots movement known as the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, Gilets jaunes. And they really have become popular and widespread, just condemning the kind of bipartisan neoliberal consensus in France as well. So the response of the French government now has been to try to push through this legislation that would basically kind of criminalize filming and taking photos of police brutality. So anyway, without further ado, I'm now going to cut to where we ended off in part 1, and here's the beginning of part 2. Thanks for listening.
Staying on this thread of the Silicon Valley company basically self-censoring at the service of powerful state interests, I'll toss it to both of you, but first, Ben, you should talk briefly about Richard Stengel, who's the chief propagandist, self-described chief propagandist for U.S. state media, is now at the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and has said that the First Amendment needs to be rolled back. And this is kind of consistent with the general sensibility of many of the disinformation warriors who want to suppress what the American public can see or hear because they blame social media and what they call fake news for the rise of Donald Trump, but also for all these alternative media sites which contravene U.S. foreign policy interests. And Ali, you've written about how Zoom has begun censoring Palestinian webinars, preventing Palestinian webinars from taking place, apparently under pressure from the Israel lobby. So, I guess either you can jump in, but is this kind of, are we going to see an escalation of this? I mean, I've already said it. There will be an escalation in the next 4 years of this kind of censorship.
It's already happening, and it's really terrifying because, for people like us who are, I think I want to be careful and not say we're on the margins, because I think there are a lot more people that share our views or are interested in our analysis than we're given credit for. But we're definitely on the margins of mainstream and corporate media and even, official public media in the United States. And so the internet, whether it's social media or the web, has been essential for us to be able to exercise our basic democratic rights. And that is being taken away. And it's being taken away by Silicon Valley companies working in cahoots with the government and the intelligence services. I noticed, for example, that on the Biden transition team,
That is so loud.
is that one of the Army Ranger helicopters going over you?
That actually is.
Are the
Oh,
Russians finally invading Washington, like Rachel Maddow said
Well,
they would?
that's welcome to Southeast. Anyway,
so I noticed, for example, that on the Biden Pentagon transition team is someone from Cloudflare, an internet company that takes responsibility for protecting a whole number of websites, including left-wing publications, from denial of service attacks. So it's very alarming to see someone from Cloudflare, um, getting involved with the Pentagon. But then when I dug into her, I found that, well, she'd come from the Pentagon in the first place. She worked at the Pentagon before she worked at Cloudflare. And that's just one example of the very cozy relationship between Silicon Valley and the government, the deep state. Another one is that Facebook, under pressure from liberals to do more censorship, created this so-called oversight board. And one of the people they appointed to it is Emi Palmor, the former Director General of the Israeli Justice Ministry, who is responsible for censoring Facebook in Israel, or rather transmitting to the Israeli government, transmitting to Facebook the Israeli government's requests for censorship, which Facebook almost always complied with. So that's the context we're in. And you were one of the first to warn about how Russiagate would be weaponized and used as a weapon to silence people on the left. And sadly, that is happening exactly as predicted. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't have an answer to it, except that we need to make as much noise about it and get as many people to understand that demanding that Facebook do more censorship, or Twitter do more censorship, or even applauding when Twitter labels the president's tweets, no matter how batshit they are, that is a precedent that we should not be applauding. I don't want Twitter fact-checking me. I don't want Twitter fact-checking you. I want to hear what Max Blumenthal has to say without Twitter telling me what I can and can't think about it. That's the bottom line. Do you want Twitter to tell you what you should think, or do you want to make that decision yourself?
well, it's not Twitter. It's it's the state.
It's the Atlantic Council.
Yeah, the Atlantic Council, which is just a cutout for
Exactly.
a certain faction of the national security state. And I mean, Ben, your piece on Richard Stengel spelled that out perfectly.
And one of the most the cutting edge of this is and has always been Palestine, and that's been apparent for a long time, but it's escalated with the effort to legislate, the effort that is being pushed by Israel and its lobby to legislate bogus, misleading, and politically motivated definitions of anti-Semitism that conflate, on the one hand, anti-Jewish bigotry with, on the other hand, criticism of Israel, its crimes against Palestinians, and its Zionist state ideology. This conflation is being legislated, and there is a huge effort. We're seeing it across the United States, Canada, across Europe, to legislate this so-called International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism, and to either persuade or force social media companies into adopting it, so that, very soon, the kind of criticism, necessary criticism of Israel that we do may be banned on a lot of these platforms because it'll fall under this bogus definition of anti-Semitism. And the point is, these kinds of censorship policies are always tested on the weakest and most marginal groups, and then expanded to everyone else. And that's why censorship of Palestinians and discussion about Palestine has always been the canary in the coal mine or the signal of what is coming for everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, it's actually, I think, in an evil, sinister way, it's actually a really brilliant strategy. Because if you look at the fundamental crisis going on, not just in the United States, but in the European Union, within NATO, there's a fundamental systemic crisis going on economically, politically, socially. People are extremely unhappy. People do not support their governments across Western Europe and the US and Canada. And we constantly hear that there is this threat of disinformation because people are being misinformed, which really means that people are no longer believing mainstream corporate media because we've been lied to so much, and it's just so obvious after the Iraq War, lied to about Libya, about Syria, about so many things, about Russiagate. And people have just lost confidence in mainstream corporate media, in the government. So the national security state, Silicon Valley, the CIA, the FBI, all these institutions that make up the national security state, they have these meetings, I think, clearly, and they sit around and they talk about ways that they can try to regain trust in mainstream narratives and combat what they call misinformation. And they're clearly working on censoring alternative media outlets, information that challenges or anything that exposes anything that would be inconvenient to them. And what's interesting is that I think what Ali just said is absolutely hitting the nail on the head, is that Israel-Palestine for them is one of the most useful issues, and it's so perfect for them in so many ways because, one, it makes it so easy to criminalize opposition to their agenda, because it's hard to criminalize opposition to the war in Iraq. It's hard to criminalize opposition to the coup attempt in Venezuela. The people will accuse you of being an apologist for a dictator or whatever, an authoritarian. I mean, that's a ridiculous trope, but they've done it for a long time. But they can't call you a bigot. But if you criticize apartheid Israel of the blatantly racist, colonial, violent policies toward the indigenous Palestinian population, they can criminalize it. They can call you anti-Semitic. They can say you're a bigot. And what they can do is they can widen the dragnet and basically criminalize alternative media, criminalize opposition to war in general, criminalize the anti-war movement, criminalize anti-imperialism, because anyone who's consistent, who opposes racism, who opposes war, who opposes empire, they're going to support Palestine because Israel is clearly this colonial project. It's racist. It's an ethnocratic settler colony. So at the heart of any anti-war and anti-racist and anti-imperialist movement is going to be Palestine solidarity, but with this bogus working definition of anti-Semitism that they're pushing around, with the criminalization of BDS, this state in the United States, in France, and other countries, they can effectively criminalize opposition to NATO, opposition to their war policies, and all of that by saying that it's just all anti-Semites. And it's exactly what they did to Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it's so insidious, but it really is an extremely powerful weapon. And that's why that when we saw what happened to Jeremy Corbyn, when we saw this witch hunt against anyone mildly on the left of the Labour Party, that's why we kept saying, reiterating ad nauseum, you can't give them an inch because they'll turn it into a mile, right? And that's exactly what they're continuing to do. And under the Biden administration, it's very clearly going to be the agenda once again. And I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think that really we are seeing this is going to continue expanding, like Ali said, to the point where entire independent and alternative media outlets are going to be censored with the rationale that either they're criticizing Israel, so they're anti-Semitic, or they challenge dogma on COVID is another element. Like, you can't ask any questions about COVID or you're going to be censored. So it just shows how, like, what the phrase Ali just said about the canary in the coal mine, they use a certain particular issue that people might think is non-controversial, like, oh, of course we're against bigots, we're against racists, but then they just redefine that issue, they redefine that criticism in a way that widens it to give them the authority to censor anyone who challenges their power.
And it's not just unique to the United States. We need to look at what's happening in France right now. I did a documentary about this rising tide of repression in France called Je ne suis pas Charlie in 2015 that I published independently with James Kleinfeld. And I haven't I was in France at the time for several weeks doing a tour on Palestine, and several of my talks were just getting banned. Far right, fascistic, Jewish nationalist groups were intimidating universities against hosting me, and it was just, I felt like I was experiencing some level of the repression that French Muslims experience on a much more daily basis. And under Macron, the repression has intensified, and Palestine solidarity activism is being actively criminalized in France. But as you both mentioned, it's really sort of a test case for expanding a kind of emergency law using the most vulnerable groups as a pilot program. Ali, you've written about France. You've been following it most of your life. What's happening there, and why is it so concerning?
Yeah, there's so much happening in France, and it's shocking how little attention it's getting. I mean, it's getting some attention, but compared to this, alarm bells should be ringing everywhere about what's happening in France, because if that is what's coming in the other so-called Western democracies, we are truly, that's where the real fascist threat is, much more than Donald Trump. I think the real fascist threat comes dressed in liberal, in liberal tones. And there's a couple of things happening in France. In France, like other countries, has been prosecuting BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions activists for years. These are Palestine solidarity activists. And in June, there was a landmark decision by the European Court of Human Rights, which overturned the convictions of a bunch of activists who had called on shoppers not to buy Israeli goods. And it said these criminal convictions in France violated their fundamental right to freedom of expression and freedom of association that is enshrined in the European Convention of Human Rights. Well, it emerged that the French government has decided, that France is bound by these precedents, but basically the French Justice Ministry has decided to ignore this precedent-setting ruling and has ordered prosecutors to double down on prosecuting Palestine solidarity activists in France, completely ignoring this ruling. But this is happening against the backdrop of a much bigger and more frightening repression in France, which goes far beyond Palestine solidarity. And there have been a couple of reports recently from Amnesty International, one in September and then a more recent statement. The one in September found that in 2018 and 2019, more than 40,000 people in France had been convicted under vague laws which criminalize so-called contempt of a public official. And many of them were protesters, the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest protesters, who were protesting against the neoliberal policies of Emmanuel Macron. And France is every year taking tens of thousands of people to court to criminally prosecute them basically for protesting. And one of the convictions cited by Amnesty International was for two men who were convicted for burning an effigy of Emmanuel Macron during a protest. So that is an example of contempt of a public official. And the irony is that France is also waging a war against its French Muslim population under the banner of supporting free speech. Remember the whole thing about the disgusting, racist, anti-Muslim cartoons that were originally published by Charlie Hebdo. France is now basically, forcing school children to look at these cartoons, and if they flinch, or if they express any kind of qualms about this, punishing them. Of course, there were the recent horrific attacks, the killing of the French school teacher Samuel Paty, who had shown these cartoons in his class. And then there was the attack on the church in Nice. But what is notable about the attackers, one was an 18-year-old who had recently come from Chechnya, who killed Samuel Paty. And the accused person in the attack on the church in Nice had come from Tunisia very recently, within the past few months, had come from Tunisia via Italy. Neither of these guys were from French Muslim communities. But what Macron is doing is using these horrific attacks as as sort of the pretext to wage all-out war, demonizing and dehumanizing the 6 or 7 million French citizens who are Muslim. And I want to read you a passage from an article by Joseph Mashad, the Columbia University professor you've had on your show, talking about what Napoleon did to the Jews in the early 1800s. It's just a couple of paragraphs, but it's I think so important to understand this history of anti-Semitism in France. And Mashad writes, it should be remembered that in 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte convened an assembly of Jewish notables and interrogated them about their religious beliefs and traditions, including polygamy, divorce, marriage with Christians, to ensure that they could become citizens equal to French Christians. He demanded that Jews denounce their own traditions and cross-examine them based on his perception of alleged Jewish separatism and national disloyalty in order to assess whether they would be loyal French citizens and if they would defend France and obey its laws. The Jewish notables formed a council and assured Napoleon in their response that Jewish life and Judaism are fully compatible with French values, as all aspects of Judaism and Jewish life that would be incompatible had already been purged from the community, including polygamy. They also emphasized that a Jew is required to consider the land of his birth or adoption as his fatherland and shall love and defend it when called upon. This submission to Napoleon did not save French Jews from ongoing anti-Semitism and continued through the Dreyfus Affair at the end of the 19th century and the Vichy government during World War II, let alone from the ongoing anti-Semitism of today's racist right wing in France. Now, Macron is doing a carbon copy repeat of what Napoleon did to the Jews. Just in the last 2 weeks, Macron convened sort of the top French Muslim leaders, the heads of various Muslim organizations, and told them, you have 2 weeks to come up with a charter of a new Muslim charter of Republican values, so-called Republican values, which affirms that Islam is compatible with French Republican values, that affirms that Islam is only a religion and can have nothing to do with politics. Basically, he's banning so-called political Islam. And they have to come up with a scheme to license imams. So whereas French laïcité or secularism is supposed to be about state neutrality and state distance from religion, what Macron is doing is creating a state Islam which is regulated and licensed by the state, where you're not even allowed to preach. You know, in the United States, freedom of religion means anyone can preach their faith. In France, you will have to have a license to preach Islam, and Islam is the only religion that is being targeted in this way. And of course, if Muslims refuse, then they are will be punished by the state. Macron has basically said that. He said, if they refuse, then we'll see what we'll do. And in the meantime, the French government has moved to shut down Muslim civil society organizations and charities, including CCIF, which is, the main organization that tracks Islamophobia in France. with no pretext. CCIF is not accused of any crime. And ironically, the person sort of leading on this is the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, who is under judicial investigation for rape and sexual harassment against two women. These accusations date from 2009, but the case is ongoing. And when the case was reopened recently, because there was a previous judge who had closed it and then it was reopened, Darmanin said that he insists on his right to a presumption of innocence, which is totally fair. But Muslims and Muslim organizations in France are not being given a presumption of innocence. Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, Robert Spencer, Daniel Pipes, all of these right-wing Islamophobia industry fanatics in the United States can only dream of doing a fraction of what Emmanuel Macron is doing to Muslims in France in broad daylight with almost total silence from the so-called civilized and liberal world.
Well, and it's especially incredible when you consider the number of kind of enlightened liberal bourgeois kind of pundits and so-called public intellectuals in the U.S. who, during the Trump era, were actually they were romanticizing Macron and saying that he's the great example of this moderate statesman who can govern in a civilized way. Comparing him, even SNL had this extremely bad skit. I mean, there was nothing funny about it, where all of like the NATO leaders are at lunch, and Macron is kind of like the leader who's like he's like the cool kid at the lunch, and they refuse to sit with Trump, and even Boris Johnson joins with Macron and Merkel and the other Western European leaders. So it's absolutely incredible, because Macron right now is doing exactly what Marine Le Pen wanted, the French far right wanted. But just a year or two ago, The Atlantic magazine and the New York Times were praising Macron for being such a moderate voice in Europe.
Yeah, and you have to think about what's going to happen with France's presidential elections in 2022. Obviously, Macron is trying to outflank Marine Le Pen in the National Front, the traditional far-right, anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, white supremacist party in France. But what he's doing is legitimizing all their politics. And as we've seen time and again, why would people vote for the carbon copy or the copy when they could have the real thing? So what he's doing is legitimizing everything that Marine Le Pen and her father before her, Jean-Marie Le Pen, have been saying for decades. And Marine Le Pen will be able to run in 2022 saying, see, I told you so. Everything that we said all along, Macron has now admitted we were right, and we will go much further than Macron. So it is a very frightening time. Similar things are happening in Austria. And the point that Max makes so well in his book, The Management of Savagery, which can't be emphasized enough, is how much this backlash, this far-right neo-fascist backlash, has been enabled by the or given oxygen by the refugee crisis that was fueled by the proxy wars that the so-called centrists and moderates in Europe and in the United States have been waging for so long. And you talk about someone like Antony Blinken, the incoming Secretary of State, who, of course, supported the Libya intervention. And Libya has been one of the main starting points or transit points for refugees coming into Europe. You talk about Blinken, who was one of the biggest supporters of the Obama administration's pumping of $1 billion in weapons into Syria under Operation Timber Sycamore, much of which ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda and related groups, and prolonged a war that sent millions of people from Syria into Europe and across Europe and provided the fodder for these right-wing groups, and also provided this tiny number of unstable, disaffected, nihilistic young men who've carried out attacks that then used to scapegoat the entire community. For example, it's been reported that the killer of Samuel Paty, this has been reported in the French media, citing judicial sources, that the killer of Samuel Paty reportedly had contacts with rebels in Idlib in Syria. And it's unclear whether any of those rebels were the same ones who have been armed and funded by the French government. Maybe we will find out. But it's so reminiscent also of the case of the Manchester bombing in Libya, the Manchester bombing in the UK, with the connections of the bomber and his father to the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which of course was backed and supported by British intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's okay. We can rest assured. We can be sure that they were moderate rebels, so it's okay.
Well, yeah, I mean, Salman Abedi was one of and his father, Ramadan, were some of the moderate rebels that came out of the Manchester Libyan Islamic Fighting Group that had been maintained by the British MI6 as a card to use against Gaddafi. And when it was time, they basically gave them free passage and visas to go to Libya. And Salman...
And don't forget that. When Salman Abedi was in Libya, it was actually a British Navy vessel that actually rescued him.
Yeah, I was getting there. That was going to be like the end of the story. So that kind of ruined the ending. But yeah, a British Navy vessel rescued them after their work was done so that Salman Abedi could come back and, after training with ISIS and even going to Syria after their work in Libya was done, come back to the UK and commit the worst terror attack, I think, in British history, the Manchester bombing at a concert where mostly teenage pre-adolescent girls
were going to listen to Ariana Grande. A horrific attack.
Yeah.
But those
British national security state fingerprints are all over the whole thing, and it's been suppressed.
That's none of what you're saying is in dispute. Those facts have not been disputed, if I'm correct. And yet, none of this is in the public consciousness.
Right.
There's been no open reckoning with the role of the British state in that horrific attack, just as there's no reckoning in France with the role of the French government and French intelligence services in fueling these proxy wars that are now blowing back all across Europe.
Yeah, France was early on in the Syrian proxy war, completely on board with arming the so-called moderate rebels. I mean, they were pumping arms in just as much as the CIA and and Turkey and the Gulf states were. This is chickens coming home to roost in so many ways. And I remember when I published my investigative series on the White Helmets in 2016, which was just so controversial in the US because I just stated facts that were obviously true about this not actually being some altruistic rescue operation, but actually being an influence operation designed to destabilize Syria that was funded by our governments and represented one of the worst scandals of our times. I actually got, through some friend of a friend in France, they said there is an influential publication here that wants to run your story, and it would cause a national uproar, and it's called Elements. And I said, what the hell is Elements? And I looked it up, and it was a publication of the French New Right. And I said, no way. Like, I'm not, I don't want to work with the right wing in France or anywhere else. Publish it in a publication that has helped to fuel Islamophobia. But in France, and it's somewhat true in the United States as well, but this is especially true in Europe, the far-right Eurosceptic forces around the National Front, the AfD, the people around Nigel Farage in the UK, the pro-Brexit right wing, they're the only ones who have put up resistance to these policies, and they are the only ones willing to say this will cause massive blowback in our societies, and we do not want to destroy Syria or Libya because we don't want the refugees. They want to not destroy it for maybe racist, Islamophobic reasons. And then you have the center left of the failing center left, and they're like, let's go bomb the hell out of them. I wrote about Jo Cox, who was murdered by a far right activist. It was like the opening cry of Brexit. She was, obviously super Remain, but she was also taking the lead from the center left. She was the absolute lead in attacking Jeremy Corbyn from inside the Labour Party over Syria and wanting to go to war on Syria. And she was going to issue a report prior to her death about the need to go to war in Syria because this was not going to be like Iraq. And that report was then posthumously issued by her husband, who in issuing it attacked Jeremy Corbyn after Jeremy Corbyn, in honor of Jo Cox's legacy, called for people to donate to the White Helmets. It was just like another time when he got his face stepped on. But my point is, Jo Cox advocated these wars and then wanted to welcome all the refugees they created with open arms, and British voters, including the kind of working class voters who live in what, Labour's red wall that completely fell in the last campaign, they didn't want it. And the center left is collapsing as a result. And so the far right has seized the narrative on this, which seems very sensible. Let's not destroy other countries so that we have refugee crises. That is the political crisis that Europe faces. And it's why Le Pen is waiting in the wings, and why I think Macron is overcompensating for the fact that he's sort of a liberal centrist bankster. It's pretty depressing to watch. It's just the complete destruction and in some ways the self-immolation of the left in Europe. And we've witnessed it here in the US, not that we have had a real powerful left for generations since the McCarthy era. So here we are. And
it's also worth mentioning in the French context that the so-called French Socialist Party, which, like a lot of the kind of center-left social democratic forces in Europe, just became neoliberal by the 1990s. But the French Socialist Party barely even exists anymore. And there's a fundamental crisis.
And this is why.
Yeah, I mean, the French Socialist Party actually, it hemorrhaged so many seats under former President Hollande that it almost didn't even meet the threshold needed to be continued as a registered party. Like, it basically doesn't exist as a political force.
Same with the Netherlands.
But remember that in the last French presidential election, I think the socialists dropped to something like 6%, and their candidate was humiliated. But remember that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the left-wing candidate, got something like 21 or 22% in the first round. So he was just very close behind, Macron and whoever the other top contender was. The point here is there is, I think in the United States, in France, in the UK, a potential constituency for a real left-wing politics that is left-wing economically and left-wing and anti-interventionist and anti-war internationally. But I don't fully understand why nobody is stepping up. That's a huge political gap and a huge political opportunity. And, well, I guess people are trying. I mean, Bernie Sanders made a half-hearted attempt in the United States with a lot of shortcomings and then folded very quickly. Mélenchon is still there and may or may not run in 2022. But it's interesting to see how the Israel lobby in France is also trying to smear him as anti-Semitic, trying to do a Jeremy Corbyn on him, so to speak. But it is something of a puzzle as to why there is such a lack of imagination on the center-left, that even center-left opportunists don't see like an opportunistic motive to move into this glaring political void, which is not racist, but is also anti-war. Unlike the racist ultranationalist far right? Can we have an anti-war politics that is not racist and far right? You'd think so.
Well, I think that the issue is that it's simply not allowed. Is that, I mean, everything we were talking about before is just talking about how there are all these structural obstacles and impediments that say, I mean, the corporate media will not give any of these people a voice. The corporate media will give the far right a voice, as we saw during Donald Trump's campaign when they were just making, as Les Moonves said, we're swimming in money. We're making so much money. It might be bad for America, but it's good for CBS. And it's not good for CBS to give a platform to any leftist who's going to rail against billionaires and corporate oligarchs and foreign wars that they all support. So the reality is that these same institutions that are supposedly safeguarding democracy, according to the neoliberal elites, they're the ones that are actually preventing a leftist alternative from being able to come into fruition. And this isn't even to mention in the European context that after the end of the first Cold War, at least the kind of de facto end, even though I would say that in many ways the Cold War never really ended, but after the 1990s, a lot of these left-wing parties in Europe, they were not only kind of defeated, but in some cases illegalized.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge factor. We are living in an increasingly managed democracy. I mean, I think if I was going to do a sequel to The Management of Savagery about the Biden era and how it came into being through Russiagate and all of the confected narratives of the last 4 years, I would call it The Management of Democracy. And part of that is to prevent what I think the centrist elites who sort of are trying to consolidate their control in the Biden era would call populism. And right-wing populism's kind of, when it comes into power, it's stupid and crazy. It's kind of easy to discredit. And it has an increasingly narrow base among, white males who didn't have college education, who live in economically developed areas. That's why Trump really wasn't able to be reelected. His base had kind of narrowed out. Along with the fact that he came under sustained, calculated attack by corporate media and big tech and so on. That's all true. The real fear, I think, is the kind of consistent left-wing, I hate using the term populist, but like a left-wing populist candidate, someone like a Corbyn or Mélenchon, who's actually willing to fight in the U.S. context. And there's just, I don't see anyone on the horizon who fits that description. The person who gets the most attention in the U.S. as a kind of left-wing legislator is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, and she really represents the other problem with bringing a candidate like this to the forefront, someone who is anti-war and anti-neoliberalism, who represents just a true left politics, and it's a lack of political education. She's a product of American society, and so many of these other people who identify with the left really are, and they don't have the political education to understand international relations, to understand the Palestinian issue, and to digest all of it and come into politics in their 30s at a time when they need, maybe a decade or two to build up the kind of constituency they would need for a national political run. And that perfect example of that was when she signed up for Americans for Peace Now's Yitzhak Rabin banquet. It appeared pretty clear that she just signed up for it because she didn't know who Yitzhak Rabin was and just assumed he was just an Israeli peacemaker who was anomalous to the Israeli political scene, didn't know his history in the Nakba, didn't know him as the author of the Ramle Lida Death March, didn't know him as the bone breaker of the first Intifada, didn't know all of this history of him in the Israeli military as a general. And it became an embarrassment for her where she got caught in between her actual constituents, who are sort of people like us. I mean, I'm not her constituent, but whatever, and who wanted her to pull out of the dinner, and the people who effectively control the Democratic Party, who are pro-Israel and aligned with the Israel lobby. That whole thing could have been avoided if she had the political education it took, but that's why she doesn't take strong anti-war positions. That's why she's unable to stand up for Venezuela. She doesn't want to get in an argument about that where she has to actually articulate why people in the U.S. should stand in solidarity with Venezuela against this imperial medieval siege. So that's who and that's who's marketed to us on the cover of Vanity Fair. And so that kind of politics, that hollow leftism, replicates itself. And everyone I know, people like Ben Norton, who have the political education at a young age and come to the table with a serious, sophisticated understanding of how the world really works and what social transformation requires, they're so disillusioned with the Democratic Party by this point, they don't want anything to do with U.S. politics. And so they're heading off to Managua or whatever, to actual revolutionary societies. That literally everyone I know who I consider smart on politics would want very little to do with the Democratic Party. I know a few people that are in Bernie's scene that are still in that world, and they're hoping, like their big hope for the Biden administration is to have end the war in Yemen, do like the war powers resolution, but we'll see if that's successful. But it's like a very narrow window for them to achieve anything. And it can be very disillusioning to dedicate so much energy and to work 16-hour days and then come up empty-handed. So that's where I see the U.S. and Europe. I think the repression is just more extreme. The management of democracy is hyper-managed.
Well, I just wanted to say, in the U.S. context, I mean, people can have shortcomings in terms of their political education, and they can have a willingness to expand their political education or a resistance to it. Those are things that one can work with. But what I don't understand when you take the so-called left or the so-called squad is, where is the fight? I mean, this election, Biden won in really extraordinary circumstances, and it wasn't, Biden won, but it wasn't the Democratic Party blowout that many people had predicted. People were talking about the Democrats expanding their majority in the House, taking the Senate outright. As we know, that's not what happened. As we know, Nancy Pelosi managed to lose seats in the House to the point where we're talking about, a bare 4-seat majority when all the votes are counted. So what if we look ahead over the next 2 years? What's going to happen? Likely two more years of what they call gridlock, where even if the Democrats do pass something, the Senate is going to block it, assuming that the Democrats don't take it. And nothing is going to happen. I mean, the Republicans are going to do everything possible to paralyze the Biden administration and then take back the House and take back the White House in 2024. Now would have been the moment for Ocasio-Cortez and for the rest of the left to put up a public fight and to say to Nancy Pelosi, at the very least, if you want our support, we demand this, this, and this. And to do it publicly, to pick a fight with them, to rally people, to fight for an actual cause. And instead, what do? They all fold and re-elect the complete political failure plutocrat Nancy Pelosi in exchange for nothing. That, to me, is unforgivable. A lack of political education is forgivable because it can be remedied. But what is the point of having these people there if they don't put up a fight, if they don't demand anything, if they don't take a stand? Even if they thought they were going to lose, they should have run a candidate against Nancy Pelosi and said, we're running a candidate on this platform to be Speaker of the House, and put the Democratic Party on notice. And I don't say this as someone who has a great faith in the Democratic Party or electoral politics, but if you are going to play that game, isn't that the minimum you should be doing? And they are not doing it.
And they're not doing it because they're ambitious, I assume. Because I assume AOC would want to run for Chuck Schumer's seat someday. I mean, I have to assume there's an ulterior agenda there. And the fact that there is no pressure on them internally or from the left, from their supposed constituency, to do that. It's just depressing to watch. And what I see the progressives in Washington doing, the sort of official, respectable anti-war groups that aren't necessarily anti-wars. They're getting behind Joaquin Castro for House Foreign Relations chair. House Foreign Affairs chair. I mean, how, like, it's just, he's marginally better than the other option, which is like someone who is built in an APAC factory, like, robo APAC House member, but where has he differed from the establishment on Syria, for example, where he supported Trump's airstrikes after Duma? On Venezuela, he echoed the president's rhetoric. I mean, it's really pathetic to see the options here, and that's why so many are disillusioned. I can say, because I talked before about what it was like and how this moment does remind me of 2008. There at least is, and I think this is a generational issue. It seems to be a Generation Z kind of factor here. There is an element that is just not falling for the identitarian bullshit of a Biden administration and are disgusted by it. But they have nowhere to turn in American politics. I mean, you can see it like these ridiculous tweets by, wax museum sculpture, Men's Warehouse mannequin, corporate media pundit hacks who say, forget about the policy. These are like decent people coming into the national security team of Biden, and they're diverse. And these tweets just get ratioed. And you look at who's ratioing them. It's people who grew up in the Obama era after the financial crash and never fell for the messianization of Obama. So I would say there's hope there, but there's nowhere for them to go.
I agree. I agree with that. I remember feeling a lot lonelier in 2008 when everyone was. And remember, I was in Chicago. Practically everyone went to Grant Park on the night of Obama's victory, and I stayed home very grumpy. And
I was there, but I was grumpy there.
Well, I was at home grumpy, and I just felt like the world had gone mad and everyone was utterly delusional. I understood I understood intellectually why people were having this reaction, especially after George Bush. But then you hope that people actually start to look at the reality and see what Obama is doing. But they never did. That it was everyone went out to brunch, basically. Not everyone. There were people who kept fighting the good fight. But the point is, a lot of people just don't pay attention if it's someone who makes them feel good. I do feel this time that maybe it's because you're in Washington and you're in a more concentrated blob situation. But out here in the Midwest, to the extent that we have contact with other humans these days, I don't feel like people are falling for it the same way. And I do see online a lot more criticism, a lot more, outright. People just don't buy the bullshit. They don't buy the identity bullshit, and they are saying, we actually demand things. We deserve things, and we demand things. We deserve health care. We deserve debt cancellation. We're not going to be just fobbed off by Kamala Harris's, what was it she tweeted yesterday? A pumpkin pie recipe, and that's supposed to be what, you get a free pumpkin pie recipe from Kamala Harris or a free PDF of Obama's shitty book. And that's not what people need and want at all.
Yeah, I really can't see any consensus. And what the Democratic Party has, which they put on display during the campaign after Biden had pretty clearly secured the nomination, was just voter shaming, just shaming anyone who didn't get in line behind Biden and what was to come. And there will be another kind of Tea Party style Republican attack that might be even more forceful and sort of semi-grassroots because it'll be guided by Donald Trump. against Biden, and then if you don't fall in line behind Biden, then you're allowing the Republicans to win and to destroy and delegitimize his administration, and everything will be blamed on them. Every failure will be blamed on them. That's what they have. They don't have anything to inspire people with. They don't have hope and change anymore. They have fear and shame. And then beyond that, they have a pandemic, which has been completely politicized. So I think from our point of view, I mean, we, of course, never fell for the bullshit at the gray zone, but we're just going to continue to expose his national security team because we know their history, and to educate people. I think that's what we need now more than anything, is just political education. The American public is never given the facts about foreign policy. Foreign policy is one of the least democratized areas of policy making in the it is the least democratized area of policy making in the US. I mean, Reagan famously said Americans don't care about foreign policy. So, I mean, that's what I think our job is at the gray zone. And I would say Electronic Intifada has been doing the same thing. I mean, I met you, Ali, at the dawn of the Obama era, and I feel like we, bonded over our mutual disgust with everyone who worshipped Obama. I was in Grant Park that night, and what I saw was amazing. Actually, I saw a side of America I'd never seen, where people of different races and classes, including like very poor people from Chicago, were coming out and hugging each other, and they were expecting something revolutionary because they had been sold a false marketing campaign and bought into it. How would they all know better? And I knew the reason I was grumpy or upset was that Obama was going to take that hope and completely smash it and divert it into something that was ultimately self-serving. And so here we are. And I think, there is no Grant Park. No one can go to Grant Park right now. So those people who went through those years, who were asking questions, we're going to try to give them answers.
And I think it's important to focus on what is hopeful and what we can do, and keep doing the work of reporting and political education and analysis. I know that personally, that's what sustains me is listening to the work of other people who are just unwilling to accept the narrative that is forced down our throats by the consensus of mainstream media, of Ivy League think tankers, of the whole Washington blob and its extensions around the country. But I have to admit, I'm not looking forward to the next 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 years of Obama's versus Trump versus Clinton's, which I think we're doomed to. I think I have a sense that Michelle Obama is being groomed to run for office. And so that may be the revenge of the Obamas. Maybe it'll be Michelle Obama versus Ivanka Trump in 2024, and that will be the most intersectional and revolutionary, history-making ticket ever.
With Chelsea as her Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Ben, you have anything to add before?
Yeah,
I feel like this could be a good point to.
Yeah, I think it's a good point to end on. There was just one other point I wanted to make before we conclude here, and that was about, going back a few minutes to when we were talking about France and looking at how these forms of repression that we see expanding across Western Europe are also being implemented in the United States and vice versa. And there's another development that's going on that's related, is that the French government under Macron is trying to push through this legislation that would effectively illegalize posting videos or photos online of police. The way they're writing the law is they're doing it in this insidious way where they claim that what would be illegal, what would be a crime, is if you knowingly endanger a French police, but it's written in such a vague way if you post a photo or a video that would endanger a police, So it's written in like this kind of vague way where all the state has to do is that the video or photo that you posted, all they have to do is prove that that somehow endangered the police. And of course, we saw how the term, even in the U.S. legal system, which in some ways is actually not as harsh as the French legal system. Not that the French legal system, or not that the U.S. legal system is great. I mean, it's obviously awful. It's draconian against poor people and black people. But the French legal system, especially when it comes to civil liberties, is often even harsher in these cases. And the point is that all the French legal system has to do is prove that that video or photo endangered the police. And if think about how in the U.S. legal system, they have implemented the idea of material support. Material support has been totally rewritten, and it doesn't even mean material anymore. It just means it means immaterial support. So if you spoke with someone, that can be these days in the U.S. legal system that has been considered a form of material support. Or if you send someone an email.
Or if you publish an article, if you're a publication and you publish an article from somebody who is a member of a designated U.S. government designated terrorist organization, that could potentially be material support. So the material support law is a direct attack on the First Amendment, the way it's being used or threatened to be used very vaguely. And in France, the law you're talking about that was just passed by the National Assembly is another one of these, what Amnesty called vague laws, which are used to basically crack down on dissent. You know, that already thousands of people every year in France are being charged under these vague laws for such things as protesting Emmanuel Macron. And this particular law is going to greatly expand the repressive reach of the already impressive and formidable reach of the French state. And I just want to say that, you know, that Macron is, you know, like there must be so-called dictators around the world, you know, the officially designated enemies of the United States and NATO and the West, who are just looking at France with great envy and wondering how Emmanuel Macron is able to do all this without, without his international image being tarnished. He would be the envy of any CC or any other US-backed dictator for what he's able to get away with right now.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think that's a dark note to end on, but I think it's true. And the reason I brought that up, that final point about the law, is that you can bet that if France passes this law, which would effectively criminalize filming police and police brutality, which has been a major issue in France as well as the United States, you can bet that lawmakers in the United States are going to try to do the same thing and model a similar law to try to crack down on the uprising against state racism and state violence. So, you know, it's not a very positive note to end on, but I do think that the positive note we can always keep in mind is that the reason that these undemocratic, increasingly authoritarian regimes, these so-called democracies, the reason that they're forced to carry out these forms of repression is because they're so unstable. It's because they actually do fear these social movements. And we see with the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, that movement is very powerful and widespread. We see in the United States, we've seen in this past year, a massive historic uprising. And the point that kind of consoles me, I mean, it's not in like a kind of hopelessly naive, optimistic way, but in a way just understanding how history moves, that, you know, I think there's so much bad to look forward to for the Biden administration. It's going to be so awful in so many ways. But we should keep in mind that it was Black Lives Matter that first emerged, not under Trump, but under Obama. And it was Occupy, a movement that seems so distant in the past now, nearly 10 years ago. It began in 2011. But the fact is that Occupy happened under Obama, not under Trump. So, and this is in the first term of Obama. So this is pretty soon after people realized that the promises of hope and change were just false promises. So I think that the note we can maybe end on is that although Biden certainly offers nothing positive to expect, I think the fact that so many young people, as Max mentioned, have already been disillusioned with him, I think is a sign that, yes, we will definitely are going to face more repression, more austerity, more censorship, more intervention, more war, but I think more resistance on the streets, ideally.
Definitely. So Ali, where can we, for those of you who haven't followed our previous episodes with you, where can they follow you and how can they support Electronic Intifada?
Well, they can support the Electronic Intifada first and foremost by reading and sharing our work. We have a great group of reporters and writers and analysts. You can just search for Electronic Intifada. You'll find us. I'm on Twitter at Ali Abunimah, and you basically can't avoid me.
Yeah.
No, I was kidding.
And especially,
Yeah, I'm on Fox, MSNBC, CNN, ABC. No, you'll find me on Moderate Rebels and a couple of other grumpy shows, but I'm very happy to be welcomed on them.
pretty much the only place you can find me.
We're happy for you to be a friend of the show, Ali.
Thank you. Better than being an enemy of the show.
Yeah, we need to do another thought loser someday soon. And, some of the thought losers I thought about singling out are people who, while they put their heart and soul into supporting Biden and being good little DNC media proxies, are going to have a bad time in the Biden era because they can't mobilize fear and resentment of Trump anymore. And the person I feel the most sorry for is that lip syncing, the Milli Vanilli comedian, the lady who lip syncs Trump.
Sarah Cooper.
I mean, who's she going to lip sync anymore? I mean, her organic comedy is horrible. That's why we'd never heard of her before she came up with that gag. So I really feel sorry for these people. I mean, I know they wish Trump won, but sorry about that. Anyway, yeah, thanks a lot, Ali. And you can support us at patreon.com/moderate rebels. We do this all by ourselves. Well, actually, Ben does.
And you're doing a great job.
Thank you. All right,
Thanks,
we're
Ali.
out.
Appreciate it.
Peace.
See ya.